Hello everybody and welcome to the inaugural episode of the CFNcast. This is a podcast that I am doing in partnership with CFN, and you might be wondering who I am and what I'm even qualified to talk about, if anything. And I'll answer that for you. So my name is Drew O'Brien. I also go by Chocolatier Games, which is my development studio. And I am one of the main editors and writers for the CFN website, and I also used to produce a lot of content for the CFN YouTube channel. So, I really love indie games, and I'm a big fan of indie games. I always have been, and I'll explain why later. But I started a podcast a while back called The Indie Spot, and I hosted it through CFN. But that podcast sort of fell through just because I was inexperienced and I really didn't have the commitment to commit to a weekly podcast and regularly produce really good content, and schedules wouldn't line up often, and I just didn't have enough collateral in place to be able to put things up whenever they weren't ready. So that podcast actually fell through, and I'll put a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. But I am now sort of doing a spiritual successor to that in the CFNcast. And you might be wondering what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm just going to be talking about all things indie games. From the game development to the process of marketing your game and bringing it to the people, to what I think about indie games and what makes certain games great. I will be talking about everything from how to choose a good game engine to what makes a certain kind of game great, and I'll bring on a bunch of guests that have various experience in different areas of the industry, and we'll just talk about anything and everything indie games. So, my experience with CFN has been pretty interesting. I'll talk about that really quickly to describe how I came to join this website. So, I actually used to be a developer of indie games. I started by trying to make games, and it didn't really work out. And the reason this didn't work out for me was because I wasn't able to follow through because I didn't get the right scope for my games. I would end up with these crazy, sprawling ideas that didn't really have a definite beginning and end, and I would stop a quarter of the way through with only some of it finished, knowing that I wouldn't be able to finish this with my current abilities, and I would give up and move on to a new project. And this happened for quite a while. My first major game I worked on was actually an action platformer called Guardians of Color. This game never came out, but I do hope to make it at some point. And I put up a Kickstarter for this, but then I realized that I wasn't going to be able to produce the content and the game that people were expecting. So even if I was able to successfully get it funded, it wasn't going to be as good as I was pitching it as. So I ended up canceling the Kickstarter and leaving the project because I knew it wasn't going to work out in the way that I thought it was. Then, after that, I decided to do smaller scale things like game jams, and I joined the My First Game Jam, which is a pretty fantastic twice a year game jam, or maybe once a year towards the end of the year. And through that, I found this Discord server that they were doing, and I met this huge community of developers. Through this community, I grew and I developed my abilities, and I gained a lot of connections with these people. And after it ended, I wanted to keep it going. So I brought a lot of them over to a Discord server that I created, which was going to be all about game development. And there were a few of those around, but I wanted to make one that was really focused on a community, because a lot of those were pretty faceless, and it was hard to sort of entrench yourself in the group and become part of the clique in that area. So I set this Discord up, and we were bringing in friends, and I was posting on Reddit and Twitter about it, and it ended up growing a little bit bigger than I expected, up to about 200-ish people, and that's where it's sort of staying right now. It's been a little bit stagnant recently, and I'm actually trying to grow it up more and more recently. But then through this Discord, I got sent to another Discord that I thought was interesting and that someone had recommended to me, and through there I met ComputerFiguur. And at the time, after I had finished making games, I decided I wanted to try writing about them. And I started a blog on this website called Naum, which is sort of like YouTube, but you can put up articles. And my first reviews were terrible. They were just absolutely atrocious, poorly researched, poorly written, and they just weren't very good at all. I would play a game for like an hour and then review it, expecting my opinion to matter to anybody, but I was actually getting a little bit of a following through there. So I met ComputerFiguur in this Discord, and then I decided to send him a message and ask, hey, do you want me to write for your website, which was at the time called ComputerFiguur.com. And he said yeah, and I started writing for him, all about indie games, and my skills grew and developed a little bit more and more as time went on. And then after that, we decided to start a YouTube channel where we would put up Let's Plays and reviews for indie games, and from there, it sort of blossomed into what it is today, with a huge Discord community of developers and all kinds of other people just coming together and talking about all things indie games. So now that I'm here, I can tell you about why I love indie games so much. And I've played quite a lot of all kinds of games, and the reason I keep coming back to indie games is because they have so much more variety, and they aren't restricted by the same rules that AAA games are. It feels like AAA studios will come up with a formula that's winning, and they'll just milk it until it doesn't work anymore. And then they'll make a new idea that works after a bunch of really terrible failed ideas, and then they'll just keep doing that over and over and over again until it works. And their games are so expensive to make, so they're always relying on these terrible business practices, like recently loot boxes and microtransactions, to bring in more revenue to fund these games. And I just don't think that's a healthy relationship to have with the customer. So I have found my way to indie games, where it's a lot more honest and a lot more unique. The developers aren't afraid to try new things and take drastically different ideas and put them together, or different interpretations on old genres. Two big genres that have come out of indie games have been visual novels, which really found their niche recently, and they've been developing quite a bit. And even though I'm not a big fan of the visual novel genre, it's been really interesting to watch it progress into what it is now, with things like Doki Doki Literature Club taking it to new levels. We've also seen the rise of walking simulators, these peaceful, interesting games that offer you to experience a story by progressing through it instead of fighting your way through corridors and worlds, dominating everything in your path. So these genres have been very interesting, and I don't think they would have been created was it not for the indie game industry. Because the developers aren't afraid to try new things, and I think that's what makes their games so great. And the developers are also just a lot more accessible. As someone who wants to get into programming, I've gotten a lot of advice from various game developers, and you can find them on Twitter, on Facebook, or through Discord servers, and you can talk to them, because you can never talk to a high-up in EA or Ubisoft, or even some of their developers, because they're so busy, and the lower people are so afraid to do something wrong that they don't want to talk to you often. So the smaller game developers are able to tell you about what it's like to build a game on their own, and their experiences and their failures, and pass that knowledge on to you. So it's really, really interesting to listen to them. And they're also often more open to feedback. You'll hear these developers and you'll play a game that you got recommended by someone, and you'll find that it's great, but there's a few things you didn't like. You can tell the developers through a server, and then a few weeks later, it's in the game. They've added something or removed something that you didn't think was very good. So you can see your opinion having a direct effect on these games, and that's really gratifying and fun to see happen. I've been playing indie games for quite a long time, and I'm really excited for 2018 as a year for indie games. There are a lot of games coming out that I'm very, very excited for. One game that I've recently completed and reviewed on the CFN channel has been Celeste, which was a fantastic platformer, and I gave it a very, very high score. You can check out my review. I'll put it in the show notes. I also have been playing Crossing Souls, which is from a top-down RPG-esque, sort of like A Link to the Past sort of style action RPG with a lot of interesting supernatural mechanics, and it reminds me a lot of Stranger Things in its atmosphere and characters. 2 games that I'm really excited for coming up are Skelattack, which is a really, really fun action platformer from this developer who's extremely nice. I'll link that in the description. And Eagle Island, which is a beautiful roguelike platformer that I have been playing for quite a while now. Their demo is up on itch, and I'll link that again. So I'm really excited for all of these games, and I'm really excited to talk about all of these games. And that's what I wanted to create this podcast for, was to celebrate independent games and what they've become. They're fantastic, beautiful projects, and I think more people deserve to know about them. So that's what I'm going to be doing here, and I'll be bringing on all kinds of guests. And if you ever want to jump in and talk with me about anything indie games, or you have a game you want me to talk about, just let me know in comments or a description, or shoot me an email, or find me on Twitter. All of my links will be below. And just thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the upcoming episodes.